Mary Elizabeth Jenkins Surratt was an American boarding house owner who was convicted of taking part in the conspiracy to assassinate President Abraham Lincoln. Sentenced to death, she was hanged, becoming the first white woman executed by the United States federal government. Surratt was the mother of John H. Surratt, Jr., who was later tried but was not convicted of involvement in the assassination. Early life: Mary Elizabeth Jenkins was born to Archibald and Elizabeth Ann Jenkins on a tobacco plantation near the southern Maryland town of Waterloo. Sources differ as to whether she was born in 1820 or 1823. There is uncertainty as to the month as well, although most sources say May. She had two brothers, John Jenkins, born in 1822, and James Jenkins, born in 1825. Her father died in the fall of 1825 when Mary was either 2 or 5 years old, upon which Mary's mother inherited their property. Although her father was a non-denominational Protestant and her mother Episcopalian, Surratt was enrolled in a private Roman Catholic girls' boarding school, the Academy for Young Ladies in Alexandria, Virginia, on November 25, 1835. Mary's maternal aunt, Sarah Latham Webster, was a Catholic, which may have influenced where she was sent to school. Within 2 years, Mary converted to Roman Catholicism and adopted the baptismal name of Maria Eugenia. She stayed at the Academy for Young Ladies for 4 years, leaving in 1839, when the school closed. She remained a devout Catholic for the rest of her life. Married life: Mary Jenkins met John Harrison Surratt in 1839, when she was 16 or 19 and he was 26. His family had settled in Maryland in the late 1600s. An orphan, he was adopted by Richard and Sarah Neal of Washington, D.C., a wealthy couple who owned a farm. The Neals divided their farm among their children, and Surratt inherited a portion of it. His background was questionable at best, and he had fathered at least one child out of wedlock. They wed in August 1840. John Surratt converted to Roman Catholicism prior to the marriage, and the couple may have wed at a Catholic church in Washington, D.C. John Surratt purchased a mill in Oxon Hill, Maryland, and the couple moved there. The Surratts had 3 children over the next few years: Isaac, Elizabeth Susanna, and John, Jr. In 1843, John Surratt purchased from his adoptive father 236 acres of land straddling the D.C./Maryland border, a parcel named Foxhall. Richard Neal died in September 1843, and a month later John purchased 119 acres of land adjoining Foxhall. John and Mary Surratt and their children moved back to John's childhood home in the District of Columbia in 1845 to help John's mother run the Neal farm. But Sarah Neal fell ill and died in August 1845, having shortly before her death deeded the remainder of the Neal farm to John. Mary Surratt became involved in raising funds to build St. Ignatius Church in Oxon Hill, but John Surratt was increasingly unhappy with his wife's religious activities. His behavior deteriorated over the next few years. John Surratt drank heavily, often failed to pay his debts, and his temper was increasingly volatile and violent. In 1851, the Neal farmhouse burned to the ground. John found work on the Orange and Alexandria Railroad. Mary moved with her children into the home of her cousin, Thomas Jenkins, in nearby Clinton. Within a year, John Surratt purchased 200 acres of farmland near what is now Clinton, and by 1853 he constructed a tavern and an inn there. Mary initially refused to move herself and the children into the new residence. She took up residence on the old Neal farm, but John sold both the Neal farm and Foxhall in May 1853 to pay debts and she was forced to move back in with him in December. With the money he earned from the tavern and sale of his other property, on December 6, 1853, John Surratt bought a townhouse at 541 H Street in Washington, D.C., and began renting it out to tenants. In 1854, John built a hotel as an addition to his tavern, and called it Surratt's Hotel. The area around the tavern was officially named Surrattsville that same year. Travelers could take Branch Road north into Washington, D.C., Piscataway Road southwest to Piscataway, or Woodyard Road northwest to Upper Marlboro. Although Surrattsville was a well-known crossroads, the community did not amount to much just the tavern, a post office, a forge, and a dozen or so houses. John Surratt was the hamlet's first postmaster. John Surratt expanded his family's holdings by selling off land, paying down debt, and starting new businesses. Over the next few years, Surratt acquired or built a carriage house, corn crib, general store, forge, granary, grist mill, stable, tobacco curing house, and wheelwright's shop. The family had enough money to send all 3 children to nearby Roman Catholic boarding schools. Isaac and John Jr. attended the school at St. Thomas Manor, while Anna enrolled at the Academy for Young Ladies. The family's debts continued to mount, however, and John Sr.'s drinking worsened. John sold another 120 acres of land in 1856 to pay debts. By 1857, Surratt had sold all but 600 acres of the family's formerly extensive holdings he had originally owned. Most of the family's slaves were also sold to pay debts. Still, John Surratt's alcoholism worsened. In 1858, Mary wrote a letter to her local priest, telling him that Surratt was drunk every single day. In 1860, St. Thomas Manor School closed, and Isaac found work in Baltimore, Maryland. The Surratts sold off another 100 acres of land, which enabled Anna to remain at the Academy for Young Ladies and for John Jr. to enroll at St. Charles College, Maryland. The couple also borrowed money that same year against their townhouse in Washington, D.C., and at some point used the property as collateral for a $1,000 loan. Civil War and widowhood. The American Civil War began on April 12, 1861. The border state of Maryland remained part of the United States, but the Surratts were Confederate sympathizers and their tavern regularly hosted fellow sympathizers. Confederate scout and spy Thomas Nelson Conrad visited Surratt unregistered trademark S boarding house before and during the Civil War. On March 7, 1861, Isaac Surratt left Maryland and traveled to Texas, where he enlisted in the Confederate States Army. John Jr. quit his studies at St. Charles College in July 1861 and became a courier for the Confederate Secret Service, moving messages, cash, and contraband back and forth across enemy lines. The Confederate activities in and around Surrattsville drew the attention of the Union government. In late 1861, Lafayette C. Baker, a detective with the Union Intelligence Service, and 300 Union soldiers camped in Surrattsville and investigated the Surratts and others for Confederate activities. He quickly uncovered evidence of a large Confederate courier network operating in the area, but despite some arrests and warnings the courier network remained intact. John Surratt collapsed suddenly and died on either August 25 or August 26 in 1862. The cause of death was a stroke. The Surratt family affairs were in serious financial difficulties. John Jr. and Anna both left school to help their mother run the family's remaining farmland and businesses. On September 10, 1862, John Jr. was appointed postmaster of the Surrattsville Post Office. Lafayette Baker swept through Surrattsville again in 1862, during which time several postmasters were dismissed for disloyalty. John Jr. was not one of them. In August 1863, John Jr. sought a job in the Paymaster's Department in the United States Department of War, but his application caused federal agents to be suspicious about his family's loyalties to the Union. On November 17, 1863, he too was dismissed as postmaster for disloyalty. The loss of John Jr.'s job as postmaster caused a financial crisis for the Surratt family. When John Sr.'s estate was probated in late November 1862, the family owned only 2 middle-aged male slaves. However, by 1863, Louis J. Weichman observed that the family had 6 or more slaves working on the property. By 1864, Mary Surratt found that her husband's unpaid debts and bad business deals had left her with many creditors. Several of her slaves ran away. When he was not meeting with Confederate sympathizers in the city, her son was selling vegetables to raise cash for the family. Mary Surratt was tired of running the farm, tavern, and other businesses without her son's help. In the fall of 1864, she began considering moving to her townhouse in the city. On October 1, 1864, Mary Surratt took possession of the townhouse at 604 H Street NW in Washington, D.C. The house was made of gray brick, 29 feet wide, 100 feet deep, and had 4 stories. The first floor, which was level with the street, consisted of 2 large rooms that were used as the kitchen and dining room. The second floor contained a front and back parlor, with the room in the rear used as Mary Surratt's bedroom. The third floor had 3 rooms, 2 in the front and 1 larger one at the back. The fourth floor, which was considered an attic, had 2 large and 1 small room. Surratt began moving her belongings into the townhouse that month, and on November 1, 1864, Anna and John Jr. took up residence there. Mary Surratt herself moved into the home on December 1. That same day, she leased the tavern in Surrattsville to a former Washington, D.C., policeman and Confederate sympathizer John M. Lloyd for $500 a year. On November 30, December 8, and December 27, Mary Surratt advertised for lodgers in the Daily Evening Star newspaper. She had initially said that she only wanted lodgers who were known to her personally or were recommended by friends, but in her advertisements she said rooms were available for 4 gentlemen. Some scholars have raised questions about Surratt's move into the city. Historians Kate Larson and Roy Comley have noted that although there is no definite proof, a case can be made that Surratt made the move into the city in furtherance of her and her son's espionage activities. For example, Larson and Comley say, on September 21, 1864, John Surratt wrote to Louis J. Weichman, observing that the family's plans to move into the city were advancing rapidly on account of certain events having turned up, perhaps a cryptic reference to either his Confederate activities in general or the conspiracy to kidnap or kill Lincoln. Larson has observed that although the move made long-term economic sense for Surratt, it also would have meant moving expenses and furnishing up to 10 rooms in the town money she did not have. Comley, too, found little economic reason to move into the city, concluding that it would have been more profitable to rent the H Street boarding house entirely to lodgers. The city was also a more dangerous and morally challenging place for her daughter, and Surratt had striven to keep Anna away from such influences for years. Moreover, Surratt still owed money on both the tavern and the townhouse, and would take out yet another mortgage against the townhouse in January 1865. John Jr. transferred all his title to the family property to his mother in January 1865. This act may have additional implications. A traitor's property could be seized, and John's knowledge of this was certainly his motivation for relinquishing his title to the houses and land. Mary may have known of his motivation as well, or at least suspected. If she did, then she would have possessed at least de facto knowledge of the conspiracy. Lincoln assassination. Conspiracy at the boarding house. Louis J. Weichman moved into Mary Surratt's boarding house on November 1, 1864. On December 23, 1864, Dr. Samuel Mudd introduced John Surratt, Jr. to John Wilkes Booth. Booth recruited John Jr. into his conspiracy to kidnap Abraham Lincoln. Confederate agents began frequenting the boarding house. Booth visited the boarding house many times over the next few months, sometimes at Mary Surratt's request. George Surratt and Lewis Powell boarded at the townhouse for short periods. Surratt, a friend of John Jr.'s and Booth's and a co-conspirator in the plot to kidnap Lincoln, visited the boarding house several times in the first 2 months of 1865. He stayed at the Surratt boarding house in February 1865, but he proved to be a heavy drinker and Mary Surratt evicted him after just a few days. He continued to visit the townhouse frequently afterward, however. Lewis Powell posed as a Baptist preacher and stayed at the boarding house for 3 days in March 1865. David Herold also called at the home several times. As part of the plot to kidnap Lincoln in March 1865, John Surratt, Surratt, and conspirator David Herold hid 2 Spencer carbines, ammunition, and some other supplies at the Surratt Tavern in Surrattsville. On April 11, Mary Surratt rented a carriage and drove to the Surratt Tavern. She said she made the trip to collect a debt owed her by a former neighbor. But according to her tenant, John Lloyd, Surratt told him to get the shooting irons ready to be picked up. On April 14, Mary Surratt said she would once again visit the family tavern in Surrattsville to collect a debt. Shortly before she left the city, Booth visited the boarding house and spoke privately with her. He gave her a package for Lloyd to pick up later that evening. Surratt did so, and again told Lloyd to have the shooting irons ready for pickup and handed him a wrapped package from Booth. Lloyd repaired a broken spring on Mrs. Surratt's wagon before she left. Arrest and incarceration. Around 2 a.m. on April 15, 1865, members of the District of Columbia Police visited the Surratt boarding house, seeking John Wilkes Booth and John Surratt. Why the police came to the house is not entirely clear. Most historians conclude that Weichman's friend, Department of War employee Daniel Gleason, had alerted federal authorities to Confederate activity centered on the Surratt house, but this does not explain why D.C. police rather than federal agents appeared there. Within 45 minutes of the attack on Lincoln, John Surratt, Jr.'s name had become associated with the attack on Secretary of State William H. Seward. The D.C. police as well as the Provost Marshal's office both had files on John Surratt, Jr., and knew he was a close friend of Booth's. Historian Otto Jasenskimmel has argued that David Harold's attempt to steal a horse from John Fletcher may have led them to the Surratt boarding house, but at least one other scholar has called this link uncertain. Other sources claim that eyewitnesses had identified Booth as Lincoln's attacker, and the detectives had information linking John Jr. to Booth. Mary Surratt lied, and told the detectives that her son had been in Canada for 2 weeks. She also did not reveal that she'd delivered a package to the Surrattsville Tavern on Booth's behalf hours earlier. On April 17, a Surratt neighbor told U.S. military authorities that he overheard one of the Surratt servants saying that 3 men had come to the house on the night of Lincoln's assassination and that one of the men had mentioned Booth in a theater. Other pieces of information also mentioned the boarding house as a key meeting place of the possible conspirators. Either Colonel Henry H. Wells, Provost Marshal of the District of Columbia, or General Christopher C. Auger told Colonel Henry Steele Olcott to arrest everyone in the house. Federal soldiers visited the Surratt boarding house again late on the evening of April 17. John, Jr. could not be found, but after a search of the house the agents found in Mary's room a picture of Booth, pictures of Confederate leaders, a pistol, a mold for making bullets, and percussion caps. As Mary Surratt was being arrested for conspiracy to assassinate Lincoln, Lewis Powell appeared at her door in disguise. Although Surratt denied knowing him, Powell was arrested and later identified as the man who had attempted to assassinate Secretary of State William Seward. After her arrest, Mary Surratt was held at an annex to the old Capitol Prison before being transferred to the Washington Arsenal on April 30. 2 armed guards stood before the door to her cell from the beginning of her imprisonment until her death. Her cell, while airy and larger than the others, was sparsely furnished with a straw mattress, table, wash basin, chair, and a bucket. Food was served 4 times a day, and consisted of the same thing each time: soft bread, salt pork, beef, or beef soup, and coffee or water. The other arrested conspirators had their heads enclosed in a padded canvas bag to prevent a suicide attempt. Sources disagree as to whether Surratt was forced to wear this as well. Although the others wore iron manacles on their feet and ankles, at no time was Mrs. Surratt manacled. She began to suffer menstrual bleeding, and became weak during her detention. She was given a rocking chair, and allowed visits from her daughter, Anna. She and Louise Powell received the most attention from the press. But the Northern press was also highly critical of Mrs. Surratt in its depictions of her. John Surratt, Jr. was in Elmira, New York, at the time of the assassination, delivering messages on behalf of a Confederate general. After learning of Lincoln's death, he fled to Montreal, in Canada. Trial. The trial for the alleged conspirators began on May 9. A military tribunal, rather than a civilian court, was chosen as the venue because government officials thought that its more lenient rules of evidence would enable the court to get to the bottom of what was then perceived by the public as a vast conspiracy. All 8 alleged conspirators were tried simultaneously. Historian Laurie Verge has commented that only in the case of Dr. Samuel Alexander Mudd is there as much controversy as to the guilt or innocence of one of the defendants. Lincoln assassination scholar Thomas Reed Turner says that, of the 8 people accused of plotting to kill Lincoln, the case against Surratt remains the most controversial. At that time and since, a room on the northeast corner of the 3rd floor of the Arsenal was made into a courtroom, and the prisoners were brought into the room through a side door, which prevented them from passing by or being harassed by spectators. Surratt was given special considerations during the trial due to her illness and gender. In the courtroom, she sat apart from the other prisoners. Sources differ as to whether an armed guard sat on either side of Mrs. Surratt, as they did the other prisoners during the trial. While the others wore wrist and ankle manacles in the courtroom, she did not. She was also permitted a bonnet, fan, and veil in order to hide her face from spectators. As her illness worsened during the trial, she was moved to a larger and more comfortable prison cell. Surratt was charged with abetting, aiding, concealing, counseling, and harboring her co-defendants. The federal government initially attempted to find legal counsel for Mary Surratt and the others, but almost no attorneys were willing to take the job for fear they would be accused of disloyalty to the Union. Surratt retained Reverdy Johnson as her legal counsel. A member of the military commission trying the conspirators challenged Johnson's right to defend Surratt, as Johnson had objected to requiring loyalty oaths from voters in the 1864 presidential election. After much discussion, this objection was withdrawn, but damage was done to Johnson's influence and he did not attend most of the court sessions. Most of Surratt's legal defense was presented by 2 other lawyers, Frederick Aiken and John Clampett. The prosecution's strategy was to tie Surratt to the conspiracy. Powell's arrival at her boarding house 3 days after the president's murder was critical evidence against her, the government argued. The prosecution presented 9 witnesses, but most of their case rested on the testimony of just 2 men: John Lloyd and Louis Weichman. Lloyd testified on May 13 and 15, 1865, regarding the hiding of the carbines and other supplies at the tavern in March, and the 2 conversations he had with Mrs. Surratt in which she told him to get the shooting irons ready. Weichman's testimony was important, for it established an intimate relationship between Mary Surratt and the other conspirators. Weichman testified May 16 to 19, and said that he had resided at the boarding house since November 1864. He had seen or overheard John, Jr. meeting and talking with Surratt, Booth, and Powell many times over the past 4.5 months. Weichman had driven Mrs. Surratt to the Surrattsville Tavern in April 11 and April 14, confirmed that she and Lloyd had spent much time in private conversation, testified that he saw Booth give her the package of binoculars, and attested that she had turned the package over to Lloyd. Weichman also testified at length about the Surratt family's ties to the Confederate spy and courier rings operating in the area, and their relationships with Surratt and Powell. He also testified about the December 23 meeting with Booth and John Jr. and their subsequent meeting with Booth at Booth's room at the National Hotel. Finally, he told the military tribunal about the general excitement in the boarding house in March 1865 after the failed attempt to kidnap Lincoln. Other prosecution witnesses reinforced Weichman's testimony. Lodger Honora Fitzpatrick confirmed visits by Surratt, Booth, and Powell to the boarding house. Emma Foote, Lloyd's sister-in-law, testified that she saw Mary Surratt speaking for long periods of time with Lloyd on April 11 and 14. Government agents testified about their arrest of Mrs. Surratt, Powell's arrival, and her denial that she knew Powell. The fact that Powell sought refuge in the boarding house after Lincoln's murder left a bad impression on the court as to Mrs. Surratt's innocence. Surratt's refusal to recognize him weighed against her. The agents also testified about their search of the house, and the evidence discovered there. Lloyd's testimony had been the most important for the prosecution's case, for it indicated Mary Surratt played an active role in the conspiracy in the days just before Lincoln's death. The prosecution rested its case on May 22. The defense strategy was to impeach the testimony of the key prosecution witnesses, Lloyd and Weichman. But the defense also wished to show that Mary Surratt was loyal to the Union, that her trips to Surrattsville were of an innocent nature, and that she had not been aware of Booth's plans. 31 witnesses testified for the defense. George H. Culver testified that he had pressed Surratt to pay a debt. Bennett Gwynn said Surratt had sought payment from John Nuthey in order to satisfy the Culvert debt, and Nuthey agreed that he'd received a letter from Surratt requesting that he appear at the tavern on April 11 to pay what was owed. Several witnesses impugned Lloyd's character by testifying about his alcoholism. Several eyewitnesses said he appeared completely intoxicated on the day of Lincoln's death, implying that he could not have remembered with clarity what happened that day. Augustus Howell, a Confederate agent, testified that Surratt's eyesight was poor, and that Louis Weichman was an untrustworthy witness as he had sought to become a Confederate spy himself. Anna Surratt testified that it was Weichman who had brought Surratt into the boarding house, that the photograph of Booth was hers, and that she also owned photographs of Union political and military leaders. Anna denied ever overhearing any discussions of disloyal activities or ideas in the boarding house, and said that while Booth visited the house many times his stays were always short. Anna explained her mother's failure to recognize Powell by asserting she could not see well. Honora Fitzpatrick was called back to the stand, and testified to Mary's poor sight as well. A former servant and a former slave both said Mrs. Surratt's eyesight was failing, and that she'd given Union soldiers food. Numerous witnesses were called at the end of the defense's case to testify to Mary Surratt's loyalty to the Union, her deep Christian faith, and her kindness. A number of Catholic priests were called to the stand to testify about Surratt's faith, good character, and incorruptibility. Portraying Surratt as a good Christian woman incapable of committing the crimes for which he was accused formed a large part of the defense strategy. During the prosecution's rebuttal, government lawyers called 4 witnesses to the stand, who testified as to Weichman's unimpeachable character. Johnson and Aiken presented the closing arguments for the defense. Johnson attacked the jurisdiction of a military tribunal over civilians. Aiken challenged the court's jurisdiction as well. But he also reiterated that Lloyd and Weichman were unreliable witnesses, and that the evidence against Mary Surratt was entirely circumstantial. The only evidence linking Surratt to the conspiracy to kill Lincoln, he said, came from Lloyd and Weichman, and neither man was telling the truth. Judge Advocate John Bingham presented the closing argument for the prosecution. The military tribunal had jurisdiction, he said, not only because the court itself had ruled at the beginning of the trials that it did, but because these were crimes committed in a military zone, during a time of war, and against high government officials in carrying out treasonous activities. Bingham pointed out that the Surratt boarding house was where the conspiracy was planned, and that Surratt, Booth, and Powell had all met with Mary Surratt. Booth had paid for the rental of the carriage that took Surratt to Surrattsville each time, and Bingham said this was evidence that Surratt's trips were critical to the conspiracy. Bingham also said that Lloyd's testimony had been corroborated by others, and that his unwillingness to reveal the cache of weapons in the tavern was prompted by his subservient tenant relationship to Mrs. Surratt. Bingham concluded by reiterating the government's key point: Powell had returned to the Surratt house seeking Mrs. Surratt, and this alone was proof of her guilt. Bingham also pointed out for the tribunal that the charge a person was indicted for was irrelevant. Under the law of conspiracy, if one person carried out a crime, all conspirators are guilty of the same crime. The trial ended on June 28, 1865. Surratt was so ill the last 4 days of the trial that she was permitted to stay in her cell. Both legal teams appeared to have flaws in their cases, and except for Reverdy Johnson neither team employed highly skilled attorneys. The government's case was hindered by its failure to call as a witness the man who shared Lloyd's carriage when he talked with Mrs. Surratt, or Metropolitan Police Chief A.C. Richards. The government did not fully investigate Booth's meetings with Mrs. Surratt at noon or the evening of the murder, and its questioning and cross-examination of witnesses was poorly prepared and weak. What is most important is that the government had botched the attempt to apprehend John Surratt, Jr. The defense's case, too, had a problem. The defense never followed up on inconsistencies in Weichman's chronology of Mary Surratt's last visit to the tavern, which could have undermined Weichman's entire reliability. The military tribunal considered guilt and sentencing on June 29 and 30. Surratt's guilt was the second to last considered, because her case presented problems of evidence and witness reliability. Sentence was handed down June 30. The military tribunal found Mary Surratt guilty on all charges but 2. A death sentence required 6 of the 9 votes of the judges. Surratt was sentenced to death, and the sentence announced publicly on July 5. When Powell learned of his sentence, he declared that Mary Surratt was completely innocent of all charges. The night before the execution, Surratt's priests and Anna Surratt both visited Powell, and elicited from him a strong statement declaring Mrs. Surratt innocent. Although this was delivered to Captain Christian Rath, who was overseeing the execution, Powell's statement had no effect on anyone with authority to prevent Surratt's death. But George Surratt bitterly condemned her, implicating her even further in the conspiracy. Powell's was the only statement by any conspirator exonerating Surratt. Anna Surratt pleaded repeatedly for her mother's life with Judge Advocate General Joseph Holt, but he refused to consider clemency. She also attempted to see President Andrew Johnson several times to beg for mercy, but was not granted permission to see him. 5 of the 9 judges signed a letter asking President Andrew Johnson to give Surratt clemency and commute her sentence to life in prison, given her age and sex. Judge Advocate General Joseph Holt did not deliver the recommendation to President Johnson until July 5, 2 days before Surratt and the others were to hang. Johnson signed the order for execution, but did not sign the order for clemency. Johnson later said he never saw the clemency request. Holt said he showed it to Johnson, who refused to sign it. Johnson, according to Holt, said in signing the death warrant that she had kept the nest that hatched the egg. Execution, construction of the gallows for the hanging of the conspirators condemned to death, among them Mary Surratt, began immediately on July 5 after the execution order was signed. It was constructed in the south part of the Arsenal courtyard, was 12 feet high and about 20 square feet in size. Captain Christian Rath, who oversaw the preparations for the executions, made the nooses. Tired of making nooses and thinking that the government would never hang a woman, he made Surratt's noose the night before the execution with 5 loops rather than the regulation 7. He tested the nooses that night by tying them to a tree limb and a bag of buckshot, then tossing the bag to the ground. Civilian workers did not want to dig the graves out of superstitious fear, so Rath asked for volunteers among the soldiers at the arsenal and received more help than he needed. At noon on July 6, Surratt was informed she would be hanged the next day. She wept profusely. She was joined by 2 Catholic priests and her daughter Anna. Father Jacob remained with her almost until her death. Her menstrual problems had worsened, and she was in such pain and suffered from such severe cramps that the prison doctor gave her wine and medication. She repeatedly asserted her innocence. She spent the night on her mattress, weeping and moaning, ministered to by the priests. Anna left her mother's side at 8 a.m. on July 7, and went to the White House to beg for her mother's life one last time. Her entreaty rejected, she returned to the prison and her mother's cell at about 11 a.m. The soldiers began testing the gallows about 11:25 a.m. The sound of the tests unnerved all the prisoners. Shortly before noon, Mary Surratt was taken from her cell and then allowed to sit in a chair near the entrance to the courtyard. The heat in the city that day was oppressive. By noon, it had already reached 92.3 degree Fahrenheit. The guards ordered all visitors to leave at 12:30 p.m. When she was forced to part from her mother, Anna's hysterical screams of grief could be heard throughout the prison. Clampett and Aiken had not finished trying to save their client, however. On the morning of July 7, they asked a District of Columbia court for a writ of habeas corpus, arguing that the military tribunal had no jurisdiction over their client. The court issued the writ at 3 a.m., and it was served on General Winfield Scott Hancock. Hancock was ordered to produce Surratt by 10 a.m. General Hancock sent an aide to General John F. Hartranft, who commanded the old Capitol Prison, ordering him not to admit any United States Marshal. President Johnson was informed that the court had issued the writ, and promptly cancelled it at 11:30 a.m. under the authority granted to him by the Habeas Corpus Suspension Act of 1863. General Hancock and United States Attorney General James Speed personally appeared in court and informed the judge of the cancellation of the writ. On July 7, 1865, at 1:15 p.m., a procession led by General Hartranft escorted the 4 condemned prisoners through the courtyard and up the steps to the gallows. Each prisoner's ankles and wrists were bound by manacles. Mary Surratt led the way, wearing a black bombazine dress, black bonnet, and black veil. More than 1,000 plea including government officials, members of the U.S. Armed Forces, friends and family of the accused, official witnesses, and reporters watched. General Hancock limited attendance to those who had a ticket, and only those who had a good reason to be present were given a ticket. Alexander Gardner, who had photographed the body of Booth and taken portraits of several of the male conspirators while they were imprisoned aboard naval ships, photographed the execution for the government. Hartranft read the order for their execution. Surratt, either weak from her illness or swooning in fear, had to be supported by 2 soldiers and her priests. The condemned were seated in chairs, Surratt almost collapsing into hers. She was seated to the right of the others, the traditional seat of honor in an execution. White cloth was used to bind their arms to their sides, and their ankles and thighs together. The cloths around Surratt's legs were tied around her dress below the knees. Each person was ministered to by a member of the clergy. From the scaffold, Powell said, "Mrs. Surratt is innocent. She doesn't deserve to die with the rest of us." Fathers Jacob and Ouija prayed over Mary Surratt, and held a crucifix to her lips. About 16 minutes elapsed from the time the prisoners entered the courtyard until they were ready for execution. A white bag was placed over the head of each prisoner after the noose was put in place. Surratt's bonnet was removed, and the noose put around her neck by a Secret Service officer. She complained that the bindings about her arms hurt, and the officer preparing said, "Well, it won't hurt long." Finally, the prisoners were asked to stand and move forward a few feet to the nooses. The chairs were removed. Mary Surratt's last words, spoken to a guard as he moved her forward to the drop, were, "Please don't let me fall." Surratt and the others stood on the drop for about 10 seconds, and then Captain Rath clapped his hands. 4 soldiers of Company F of the 14th Veteran Reserves knocked out the supports holding the drops in place, and the condemned fell. Surratt, who had moved forward enough to barely step onto the drop, lurched forward and slid partway down the drop, her body snapping tight at the end of the rope, swinging back and forth. Surratt's death appeared to be the easiest. Surratt's stomach heaved once and his legs quivered, and then he was still. Herold and Powell struggled for nearly 5 minutes, strangling to death. Burial. Each body was inspected by a physician to ensure that death had occurred. The bodies of the executed were allowed to hang for about 30 minutes. The bodies began to be cut down at 1:53 p.m. A corporal raced to the top of the gallows and cut down Surratt's body, which fell to the ground with a thud. He was reprimanded, and the other bodies cut down more gently. Herold's body was next, followed by Powell's. Surratt's body was cut down at 1:58 p.m. As Surratt's body was cut loose, her head fell forward. A soldier joked, "She makes a good bow," and was rebuked by an officer for his poor use of humor. Upon examination, the military surgeons determined that no one's neck had been broken by the fall. The manacles and cloth bindings were removed, and the bodies were placed in the pine coffins. The name of each person was written on a piece of paper by Acting Assistant Adjutant R.A. Watts, and inserted in a glass vial. The coffins were buried against the prison wall in shallow graves, just a few feet from the gallows. A white picket fence marked the burial site. The night Mary Surratt died, a mob attacked the Surratt boarding house and began stripping it of souvenirs until the police stopped them. Anna Surratt unsuccessfully asked for her mother's body for 4 years. In 1867, the War Department decided to tear down the portion of the Washington arsenal where the bodies of Surratt and the other executed conspirators lay. On October 1, 1867, the coffins were disinterred and reburied in Warehouse No. 1 at the arsenal, with a wooden marker placed at the head of each burial vault. John Wilkes Booth's body lay alongside them. In February 1869, Edwin Booth asked President Johnson for the body of his brother, John Wilkes Booth. Johnson agreed to turn the body over to the Booth family, and on February 8 Surratt's body was turned over to the Surratt family. Mary Surratt was buried in Mount Olivet Cemetery in Washington, D.C., on February 9, 1869. John M. Lloyd is buried 100 yards from her grave in the same cemetery. Surviving family and home. Anna Surratt moved from the townhouse on H Street and lived with friends for a few years, ostracized from society. She married William Toneri, a government clerk. They lived in poverty for a while after he was dismissed from his job, but in time he became a professor of chemistry in Baltimore and the couple became somewhat wealthy. The strain of her mother's death left Anna mentally unbalanced, and she suffered from periods of extreme fear that bordered on insanity. She died in 1904. After the dismissal of charges against him, John Surratt, Jr. married and he and his family lived in Baltimore near his sister, Anna. Isaac Surratt also returned to the United States and lived in Baltimore. He died in 1907. Isaac and Anna were buried on either side of their mother in Mount Olivet Cemetery. John Jr. was buried in Baltimore in 1916. In 1968, a new headstone with a brass plaque replaced the old, defaced headstone over Mary Surratt's grave. Mary Surratt's boarding house still stands, and was listed on the National Register of Historic Places in 2009. Citizens interested in Mary Surratt formed the Surratt Society. The Surrattsville Tavern and House are historical sites run today by the Surratt Society. The Washington Arsenal is now Fort Leslie J. McNair. The building that held the cells and courtroom, and the brick wall seen in back of the gallows, are all gone. Portrayals. Surratt was portrayed by actress Virginia Gregg in the 1956 episode The Mary Surratt Case, telecast as part of the NBC anthology series The Joseph Cotton Show. She was portrayed by Robin Wright in the 2011 film The Conspirator, which was directed by Robert Redford. References. Bibliography. Borrett, G.S. and Fornes, Norman O. The Historian's Lincoln, Pseudo-History, Psychohistory, and History. Urbana-Illinois University of Illinois Press, 1996. Breyer, Jackson R. New Essays on F. Scott Fitzgerald's Neglected Stories. Columbia, Missouri University of Missouri Press, 1996. Buchanan, Paul D. The American Women's Rights Movement, A Chronology of Events and of Opportunities from 1600 to 2008. Boston, Brandon Books, 2009. Buckley, Sally Mitchell. A Church and Its Village, St. Philip's Episcopal Church, Laurel, Maryland. Baltimore, Maryland Gateway Press, 2001. Bush, Francis X. Enemies of the State, An Account of the Trials of the Mary Eugenia Surratt Case, the Teapot Dome Cases, the Alphonse Capone Case and the Rosenberg Case. Indianapolis, Bobbs Merrill, 1954. Cashin, Joan. The War Was You and Me, Civilians in the American Civil War. Princeton, New Jersey, Princeton University Press, 2002. Catcanas, Joan L. John H. Surratt, Jr. in the Trial, The Assassination of President Lincoln and the Trial of the Conspirators. Lexington, Kentucky University Press of Kentucky, 2003. Comlee, J.R., Roy Z. Lincoln's Assassins, A Complete Account of Their Capture, Trial, and Punishment. Jefferson, North Carolina, McFarland and Colorado, 1989. Comaya, Ann and Klesmer, Deborah. Women in World History, A Biographical Encyclopedia. Waterford, Connecticut, Yorkin Publications, 2001. DeWitt, David Miller. The Judicial Murder of Mary E. Surratt, J. Murphy and Colorado, 1894. Eosenskimmel, Otto. Why Was Lincoln Murdered? New York, Grosset and Dunlap, 1937. Evans, Eli N. Judah P. Benjamin, The Jewish Confederate. New York, Simon & Schuster, 1989. Federal Writers Project. Washington, D.C. A Guide to the Nation's Capital. New York, Hastings House, 1942. Fischel, Edwin C. Secret War for the Union. New York, Houghton Mifflin, 1996. Gamba, Wendy. The Boarding House in 19th-Century America. Baltimore, Johns Hopkins University Press, 2007. Gillespie, L.K. Executed Women of the 20th and 21st Centuries. Lanham, Maryland University Press of America, 2009. Goodrich, Thomas. The Darkest Dawn, Lincoln, Booth, and the Great American Tragedy. Bloomington, Indiana University Press, 2005. Griffin, John Chandler. Abraham Lincoln's Execution. Gretna, Louisiana Pelican Publishing, Colorado, 2006. Harris, Thomas Mealy. Assassination of Lincoln, A History of the Great Conspiracy, Trial of the Conspirators by a Military Commission, and a Review of the Trial of John H. Surratt. Boston, American Citizen Company, 1892. Hartranft, John F. Steers, Edward. And Holzer, Harold. The Lincoln Assassination Conspirators, Their Confinement and Execution, as recorded in the letterbook of John Frederick Hartranft. Baton Rouge, Louisiana State University Press, 2009. Heidler, David Stephen. Heidler, Jean T. and Coles, David J. Encyclopedia of the American Civil War, A Political, Social, and Military History. New York, W. W. Norton and Colorado, 2000. Isaacson, Alfred. The Travels, Arrest and Trial of John H. Surratt. Middletown, New York Vestigian Press, 2003. James, Edward T. Notable American Women, A Biographical Dictionary. Cambridge, Massachusetts Belknap Press of Harvard University Press, 2004. Jampolla, Andrew C. A. The Last Lincoln Conspirator, John Surratt's Flight from the Gallows. Annapolis, Maryland Naval Institute Press, 2008. Johnson, Andrew. The Papers of Andrew Johnson, September 1868–April 1869. Paul H. Bergeron, ed. Knoxville, Tennessee University of Tennessee Press, 1999. Johnson, Scott Patrick. Trials of the Century, An Encyclopedia of Popular Culture and the Law. Santa Barbara, California, ABC Clio, 2011. Jones, John P. Dr. Mudd and the Lincoln Assassination, The Case Reopened. Sons, Hoboken, Pennsylvania Combined Books, 1995. Jordan, David M. Winfield Scott Hancock, A Soldier's Life. Bloomington, Indiana University Press, 1988. Katz, D. Mark. Witness to an Era, The Life and Photographs of Alexander Gardner, The Civil War, Lincoln, and the West. New York, Viking, 1991. Kaufman, Michael W. American Brutus. New York, Random House, 2004. ISBN 0-375-50785-X, Clement, Frank. Lincoln's Critics, The Copperheads of the North. Shippensburg, West Virginia, White Mane Books, 1999. Kuhn, Annette. Queen of the Bees, Ida Lupino Behind the Camera. Westport, Connecticut, Greenwood Press, 1995. Cunhart, Philip B. Cunhart, Peter W. Looking for Lincoln, The Making of an American Icon. New York, Alfred A. Knopf. ISBN A9780307267139. Larson, Kate Clifford. The Assassin's Accomplice, Mary Surratt and the Plot to Kill Abraham Lincoln. Basic Books, 2008. ISBN 978-0-465-03815-2, Latimer, Christopher P. Civil Liberties and the State, A Documentary and Reference Guide. Santa Barbara, California, Greenwood, 2011. Leonard, Elizabeth D. Lincoln's Avengers, Justice, Revenge, and Reunion After the Civil War. New York, Norton, 2004. Machinery, Robert. Liberty's Women. Springfield, Massachusetts, G. C. Merriam, Colorado, 1980. Miller, Edward A. Lincoln's Abolitionist General, The Biography of David Hunter, Columbia, South Carolina, University of South Carolina Press, 1997. Morsberger, Robert E. and Morsberger, Catherine M. Lou Wallace, Militant Romantic. New York, McGraw-Hill, 1980. Oldroyd, Osborne H. The Assassination of Abraham Lincoln, Flight, Pursuit, Capture, and Punishment of the Conspirators. Washington, D.C. O. H. Oldroyd, 1901. Ounceby, Betty J. alias Payne Lewis Thornton Powell, The Mystery Man of the Lincoln Conspiracy. Jefferson, North Carolina, McFarland and Company, 2006. Phelps, Shirl. World of Criminal Justice, Volume 2, NZ. Detroit, Gale Group, 2001. Phillips, Larissa. Women's Civil War Spies of the Confederacy. New York, Rosen Publishing Group, 2004. Pittman, Ben. The Assassination of President Lincoln and the Trial of the Conspirators. Cincinnati, Moore, Wilstack and Baldwin, 1865. Rehnquist, William H. All the Laws But One, Civil Liberties in Wartime. New York, Vintage Books, 2000. Roscoe, Theodore. The Web of Conspiracy, The Complete Story of the Men Who Murdered Abraham Lincoln. Englewood Cliffs, New Jersey. Prentice Hall, 1959. Saxman, David B. Rushing, S. Kittrell. And Morris, Roy. Seeking a Voice, Images of Race and Gender in the 19th Century Press. West Lafayette, Indiana. Purdue University Press, 2009. Schroeder-Levine, Glenna Allen Zuchik, Richard. Andrew Johnson, A Biographical Companion. Santa Barbara, California. ABC Clio, 2001. Steers, J.R., Edward. Blood on the Moon. Lexington, University Press of Kentucky, 2001. Steers, J.R., Edward. Let the Stain of Innocent Blood Be Removed from the Land. The Military Trial of the Lincoln Conspirators. In the Lincoln Assassination, Crime and Punishment, Myth and Memory. Harold Holzer, Craig L. Simmons, and Frank J. Williams, eds. New York, Fordham University Press, 2010. Steers, J.R., Edward. The Lincoln Assassination Encyclopedia. New York, Harper Perennial, 2010. Steers, J.R., Edward. Lincoln Legends, Myths, Hoaxes, and Confabulations Associated with Our Greatest President. Lexington, Kentucky University Press of Kentucky, 2007. Steers, Jr. Edward and Holzer, Harold. The Lincoln Assassination Conspirators, Their Confinement and Execution, as recorded in the letterbook of John Frederick Hartranft. Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Louisiana State University Press, 2009. Stern, Philip Van Doren. An End to Valor, The Last Days of the Civil War. Boston, Houghton Mifflin, 1958. Surratt, Mary. In the New Encyclopaedia Britannica. Chicago, Encyclopaedia Britannica, 1998. Surratt, Mary E. Jenkins. In Women in the American Civil War. Lisa Tendrich Frank, ed. Santa Barbara, California. ABC Clio, 2008. Surratt, Mary Eugenia Jenkins. In Historical Dictionary of Reconstruction. Hans Luigi Fuss, ed. New York, Greenwood Press, 1991. Swanson, James L. Manhunt, The 12-Day Chase for Lincoln's Killer. New York, HarperCollins, 2007. ISBN 0-06-051850-2, Swanson, James L. and Weinberg, Daniel R. Lincoln's Assassins, Their Trial and Execution. New York, Harper Perennial, 2008. Townsend, George Alfred. The Life, Crime and Capture of John Wilkes Booth. New York, Dick and Fitzgerald, Publishers, 1886. Townsend, George Alfred. Washington, Outside and Inside, A Picture and a Narrative of the Origin, Growth, Excellencies, Abuses, Beauties, and Personages of Our Governing City. Hartford, Connecticut. S. M. Betts and Colorado, 1874. Trindle, Elizabeth Steger. Mary Surratt, An American Tragedy. Pelican Pub, Colorado, 1996. ISBN 1-56554-185-5. Turner, Thomas Reed. Beware the People Weeping, Public Opinion and the Assassination of Abraham Lincoln. Baton Rouge, Louisiana State University Press, 1982. Van Doren, Charles Lincoln and McHenry, Robert. Webster's American Biographies. Springfield, Massachusetts, Merriam-Webster, 1984. Verge, Laurie. Mary Elizabeth Surratt. In the Trial, The Assassination of President Lincoln and the Trial of the Conspirators. Lexington, Kentucky, University Press of Kentucky, 2003. Watts, R.A. Trial and Execution of the Lincoln Conspirators. Michigan History Magazine. 6-1. Weichman, Louis J. and Richards, A.C. A True History of the Assassination of Abraham Lincoln and of the Conspiracy of 1865. New York, Knopf, 1975. Zanker, Kenneth J. The Catholics and Mrs. Mary Surratt, How They Responded to the Trial and Execution of the Lincoln Conspirator. University Press of America, 2008. ISBN 0-7618-4023-0. External links. Surratt Society and Museum, read through the Lincoln assassination papers about evidence against Mary Surratt, historic marker at the Surratt boarding house, Mary Surratt at Find a Grave, brief Mary Surratt biography, Mary Eugenia Surratt.